The Federation is a utopia, a shining beacon of cooperation, science, and peace. But what if that dream is also its greatest vulnerability? Time and again, Starfleet is blindsided by spies, saboteurs, and shapeshifters. The people who protect the galaxy often can't even protect themselves. Why is Starfleet so easy to infiltrate? Why are its defenses always a step behind? Why does a society that can bend space-time still rely on trust over caution? Now, it's easy to say, well, that's just the story. It happens because the writers need it to. But that answer is too simple, and it misses something important. Because these recurring failures, the invasions, the blind spots, the betrayals, don't just happen. They reflect something fundamental about the Federation itself. This isn't just a series of plot devices. It's a design flaw. Because the Federation wasn't built to fight. It was built to believe. And belief, unchecked, can become blindness. This is the story of how the Federation's ideals became a liability, and why, despite it all, they chose to stay vulnerable. The Federation wasn't born in peace. It was born in the ashes of a war it tried to prevent. Before the Federation, there was the Coalition of Planets, an alliance between Earth, Vulcan, Andoria, and Teller Prime. What began as a partnership of diplomacy and trade became something more when the Romulan War erupted in 2156. The Romulans fought with no faces, no words, and no mercy. The Coalition held together under fire, and by the war's end in 2160, its members had become something more than allies. In 2161, they chose to forge a new path, a peaceful path. The United Federation of Planets was born, not as a military superpower, but as a deliberate rejection of one. Starfleet, the Federation's exploratory arm, carried the same DNA. Its primary missions were diplomacy, science, and cultural exchange, not warfare. That wasn't a mistake. It was policy. After the horrors of the Romulan War, the Federation didn't want to emulate its enemies. It wanted to stand for something better. But let's be honest, the Federation never completely abandoned defense. In the early days, especially in the original series, Starfleet had a far more militaristic posture. Uniforms resembled naval command. Shipboard protocol was strict. Captains like Kirk weren't just explorers, they were warriors when needed. Starfleet still remembered its roots, and in moments of crisis, it acted accordingly. But over time, that changed. By the 24th century, Starfleet's identity had shifted. The uniform was diplomacy. The weapon was the word. The goal wasn't just to avoid a war. It was to believe war had become obsolete. And yet, there were cracks. Beneath the diplomacy, some in Starfleet knew trust wasn't always enough. That's why organizations like Section 31 existed. Not officially, not openly, but as a shadow answer to the Federation's idealism. Section 31 operated outside the law, without oversight. It was never sanctioned by the Federation Charter, but it was never stopped either. And in a way, that's the most telling sign of all. The Federation didn't build walls, but it knew others might try to breach them. And deep down, it quietly allowed someone else to do the dirty work. So yes, Starfleet had protocols. It had starships. It had structure. But it also had blind spots. And it built those blind spots into its identity. It believed that peace could be permanent, that trust was strategy, that belief itself could be armor. It wasn't naive. It was willfully hopeful. But hope, when it hardens into policy, can become something dangerous. And while the Federation looked to the stars, others were already inside. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. The Federation was built on openness, on diplomacy, on the idea that people are, at their core, good. But not everyone agreed with that vision. And in a galaxy full of shapeshifters, spies, and saboteurs, openness isn't just risky, it's an invitation. Infiltration is one of the Federation's most persistent and catastrophic failures. Again and again, hostile actors compromise Starfleet's chain of command, hijack starships, manipulate strategic infrastructure, or simply walk in undetected. And what's worse, it's not even difficult. These aren't once-in-a-generation threats, they're routine. In the Next Generation's Conspiracy, a parasitic alien species takes over Starfleet Command itself. Entire departments, top brass, replaced. No scans, no vetting, no countermeasures. In the Next Generation's Data Day, a trusted Vulcan ambassador, Ambassador T'Pel, is revealed to be a Romulan operative. She walks freely aboard the Enterprise, leveraging nothing more than a forged identity and a diplomatic status. In Deep Space Nine's The Adversary, a changeling infiltrates the Defiant and nearly triggers a war with the Zenkethi. In another episode from Deep Space Nine, in Purgatory's Shadow, Dr. Julian Bashir is revealed to have been replaced by a changeling. For weeks, he performed surgeries, issued commands, slept beside his crewmates. No one suspected a thing. These aren't isolated cases. They're warnings. Starfleet's systems don't just fail to stop infiltration. They don't even try. Even when they do medical scans, they aren't exactly reliable. In the Next Generation's The Host, Beverly Crusher doesn't realize her patient is a joined Trill, a being with a giant symbiotic organism right inside him. That's not just a rare oversight. That's an institutional flaw. Transporter pattern checks are inconsistent. Biometric security is minimal. Suspicion is discouraged. Not just by policy, but by culture. The result? Starfleet often doesn't know who it's working with, and its greatest enemies are already inside the room. The Dominion exploited that with terrifying precision. In Deep Space Nine's Homefront and Paradise Lost, just 3 confirmed changelings are enough to plunge Earth into panic. Starfleet cadets patrol the streets. Schools close. Civilians are detained or required to give blood samples. Admiral Layton stages false flag attacks. He attempts to seize control of Earth. And it nearly works. The public buys into the fear. Civil liberties evaporate. All it takes is the suggestion of a threat to unravel the ideals of the Federation. And in that moment, Starfleet had to confront a brutal truth. The greatest threat to the Federation isn't just infiltration. It's what the Federation becomes when it's afraid. But the Dominion aren't the only ones. In Picard, the Zhat Vash sabotage synthetic development, leading to the Mars attack. Tens of thousands dead, the fleet destroyed, the Romulan rescue abandoned. That wasn't a battle, it was an inside job. In the Strange New Worlds episode, Under the Cloak of War, a Klingon defector manipulates Starfleet's ideals. In Lower Decks, protocols are so lax, they're played for laughs. In Prodigy, the Protostar carries the living construct, a weapon that nearly tears apart the Federation through its own networking protocols. These aren't plot twists. They're policy consequences. The Federation doesn't want to become the Romulans, nor the Cardassians. It doesn't want to live in fear. So it chooses trust, even when that trust leads to sabotage. And when it gets burned, it doesn't learn. It doubles down. Because if the Federation changes, it stops being the Federation. But there's another danger. Not just the infiltration itself, but the fear that comes after. Fear tempts good people to give up freedom for security. Fear opens the door to surveillance, to control, to secret police. Fear empowers Section 31. But even then, when you consider episodes like Homefront, they don't end with a coup. They end with a choice. A choice to stay open, to resist paranoia, to remain the Federation. Yes, Infiltration exposed the cracks, but it also showed where the Federation draws the line. And in the chapters ahead, we'll see why that line still matters. In most empires, it's simple. Protect the state at any cost. Scan every life form. Monitor every corridor. Assume everyone is a threat. But the Federation made a different choice. It chose restraint. Starfleet doesn't screen every ambassador. It doesn't tap every communication. It doesn't demand retinal scans nor DNA locks at every door. Because the Federation doesn't just protect its citizens, it protects their dignity. And that restraint, it's not a failure of planning. It's a deliberate act of philosophical defiance. The Federation was built by worlds that had survived surveillance states, war machines, and cultural domination. Vulcans chose logic over conquest. Andorians chose alliance over isolation. Humanity had already lived through centuries of secrecy, violence, and control. Starfleet was meant to be different. Not a fortress, a symbol. In a way, it's easy to build a police state. You just stop caring who gets hurt. But Starfleet wants something harder. To remain open, even when it's dangerous. To remain idealistic, even when it's not safe. That's why medical scans are limited, why privacy is respected, why surveillance tech isn't installed by default. Because to do otherwise would mean becoming the very thing the Federation was built to rise above. This isn't just a matter of policy, it's an act of faith. Faith that most beings aren't enemies. Faith that power doesn't have to corrupt. Faith that freedom is stronger than fear. It's easy to dismiss that as naive, but restraint is harder than overreach. And when Starfleet stumbles, when someone infiltrates or sabotages or betrays, it doesn't overcorrect. It pauses. It reaffirms its principles, not because it's blind, but because it remembers what unchecked power can do. The Next Generation's The Drumhead is one of the best examples. A retired admiral launches an internal investigation into a possible sabotage. At first, it's justified, but it escalates quickly. Accusations based on ancestry, private lives dissected, fear overriding reason. And what stops it? Not the rules, not the system. One man, Jean-Luc Picard, standing up and saying, With the first link, the chain is forged. That's the price of abandoning restraint. One exception becomes two, and soon, your ideals are just slogans. The Federation doesn't want to win at all costs. It wants to win without becoming something worse. Even in Deep Space Nine, with war looming and infiltration rampant, you see this tension play out constantly. Sisko, Kira, Odo, they walk the line every day between protection and oppression. And over, they choose restraint. They let people speak. They question orders. They let dangerous truths air out in the open, because hiding them would be worse. Restraint is what holds the Federation together, not because it always works, but because it keeps them human, or Vulcan, or Andorian, or Bajoran. Of course, there are moments when restraint fails. Moments where even the best officers cross a line they can't uncross. In the pale moonlight, Benjamin Sisko conspired to forge a lie that led to a senator's death, because the truth wasn't working. And he lived with it. But he never pretended it was what Starfleet stood for. He knew it was a compromise. One made in the dark, not in the name of the light. And that's the point. Restraint isn't always easy, but it remains the standard, because without it, the Federation stops being the Federation. So yes, security is flawed. And yes, people have died. But the Federation keeps choosing trust, because the moment it stops, it becomes something else. The Federation doesn't want to join the list of governments that forgot why they existed. It would rather suffer betrayal than becoming a regime that no longer deserves loyalty. That's not idealism. That's courage. Still, that courage has a shadow. Because even if the Federation won't cross the line, someone always will. And in the next chapter, we look at what happens when the values stop at the surface, but the knives are drawn behind the scenes. The Federation doesn't cross the line, but someone always does. In public, Starfleet is guided by transparency, ethics, and trust. It stands for peace, for restraint, for cooperation. But in the shadows, someone watches, someone prepares, someone does what Starfleet refuses to admit must be done. That someone is Section 31. Unlike most intelligence agencies, Section 31 doesn't answer to any Admiralty board. It doesn't appear in public budgets. It has no uniform, no headquarters, and no chain of command. But it's not rogue. It was never authorized. Section 31 takes its name from Article 14, Section 31 of the Federation Charter, a clause that allows for extraordinary measures in times of extreme threat. In other words, it was built into the system from the beginning, not as a last resort, as a shadow contingency. A legal gray zone written by idealists who quietly knew their ideals might not always be enough. Section 31 operates in the blind spots created by Federation values, where trust limits surveillance, where diplomacy avoids confrontation, where principles prevent action. It steps in when openness becomes vulnerability. It surveils allies. It manipulates enemies. It eliminates threats before Starfleet even knows they exist. It is the Federation's invisible immune system, and its greatest ethical contradiction. In Deep Space Nine's Inquisition, Dr. Bashir is kidnapped and interrogated by a man named Sloan. No warrant, no charges, no oversight. Sloan will effectively explain, "We search out and identify potential dangers to the Federation, and once identified, we deal with them." Deal with them. Not arrest, not diplomacy. Neutralize. Bashir's response is exactly what you'd hope for. He calls it what it is: a terrorist operation flying the Federation flag. And he's right. In Inter Arma Inum Silent Legis, Bashir is tricked again, used by Sloan and Admiral Ross in a covert operation that alters the balance of power within the Romulan government. Bashir plays along under pressure and ignorance, but at the end, he's furious, disillusioned, betrayed. He sees clearly this wasn't security. It was manipulation in the name of control. Bashir never condones Section 31. He doesn't come to agree with it. He stands in contrast to it. And that's what makes him a Starfleet officer. But Section 31 isn't stopped, because Section 31 was never meant to be stopped. It's tolerated, ignored, useful. When the Dominion War reaches its peak, it's discovered that Section 31 released a biological weapon much earlier: the changeling virus, a plague engineered in secret, delivered without warning, and designed to exterminate an entire species. Not a weapon of war, a weapon of extinction. Starfleet never authorized it, but Starfleet didn't stop it either. Section 31 exists so the Federation can keep its hands clean, so Starfleet can speak of values, while someone else makes the hard choices in the dark. And the people who work for Section 31, they're not evil caricatures. They're often Starfleet's best and brightest. Highly trained, deeply committed. They believe they're protecting something worth compromising for. And that's what makes it so dangerous. It's not cartoon villainy. It's rationalized secrecy. Section 31 doesn't just hide from oversight. It hides behind good intentions. Here's the truth. Section 31 exists because the Federation is idealistic. Because its systems are open. Because its culture rejects paranoia. Because its values create gaps. And so, you don't create Section 31, you empower it. That's the cost of denial. Not just moral compromise, but institutional dependency. Because the longer the Federation avoids building security infrastructure, the more it becomes reliant on the one organization it's afraid to admit exists. And here's the worst part. Sometimes, Section 31 works. It saves lives, prevents war, wins battles. But what does it cost? How many ideals can be bent before they break? In trying to preserve the Federation, Section 31 risks reshaping it into something unrecognizable. And yet, the alternative is just as dangerous. Starfleet can't afford to ignore threats, but if it gives up its principles, if it follows Section 31 into the shadows, then what's left of the Federation we're trying to protect? This is the paradox. If ideals are armor, what do you do when they crack? If restraint is policy, who guards the people when the restraint fails? The next chapter doesn't give easy answers, because there aren't any. But it does ask the question, how do you secure utopia without becoming its jailer? You can forgive a mistake. You can't forgive repeating it. By the 24th century, the Federation had already faced dozens of infiltration attempts. It had been attacked, deceived, manipulated, from within and without. And yet, the security systems never seemed to change. Officers remained vulnerable. Ships strayed wide open. And enemies still walked in through the front door. The truth is, Starfleet doesn't learn quickly, especially when the solution challenges its identity. The Federation wants to believe every compromise is an anomaly, a mistake, not a pattern, a fluke, not a flaw. So it treats each incident as isolated, each breach as unique, each war as unprecedented. And in doing so, it refuses to evolve. In the Next Generation's Data's Day, a Romulan operative walks freely on the Enterprise using only forged credentials and diplomatic status. No biometric follow-up, no security reform. In Deep Space Nine, Bashir is replaced by a changeling for weeks. No systemic alert protocols are created to prevent it from happening again. In Voyager's Meld, a Betazoid serial killer nearly drives Tuvok insane. Psychic profiling? Never mentioned again. In Picard, Season 1, the Zhat Vash orchestrate the Mars synth attack. AI research is immediately banned, but not reformed. It takes nearly 15 years before the Federation lifts the ban, and even then, it does so only after extreme political pressure and existential threat. These aren't oversights, they're deliberate resets. Starfleet would rather move on than face what needs to change. Medical scans remain superficial. Transporter pattern checks are inconsistently used. Command codes are rarely rotated. And critical systems access is still granted based on rank and assumption, not verification. In the Next Generation's The Pegasus, we learn that Starfleet intelligence secretly conducted cloaking experiments in violation of a signed treaty. The program is hid, the commanding officers are protected, and when the truth surfaces, Starfleet does nothing. The lesson is simply ignored. And even when lessons are learned, they're often learned too late. In Picard Season 3, the changeling infiltration of Starfleet Command compromises the entire transporter network. Changelings rewrite Starfleet officers at a molecular level. Undetectable, unstoppable. Only in the final hours does Dr. Beverly Crusher recalibrate the system to reliably detect them. It works, but the damage is already done. Dozens of ships compromised, hundreds to thousands dead. And once again, the system built to protect peace had no answer for betrayal, until it was already too late. Why does this happen? Because to truly fix the system, Starfleet would have to question its own values. It would have to admit that truth has limits, that belief can become blindness, that even the brightest future needs a firewall. And that kind of introspection runs counter to everything the Federation wants to believe about itself. This failure to learn isn't just dangerous, it's disrespectful. It disrespects colonists abandoned during the Cardassian crisis, left behind when politics overruled protection. Learning from failure requires acknowledging that failure. And that's the Federation's blind spot. It wants to be the model, the example, the dream. But when it treats every wound as an outlier, it lets history repeat itself in blood. In lower decks, the tendency becomes satire. Crews forget passwords, command codes get reused, shuttles are stolen with ease. But the jokes work because it's not far from the truth. Starfleet trusts too easily, and it forgives itself even faster. Still, all hope is not lost. There are signs, small ones, that the Federation can change. Cloaking technology is studied more seriously. Transporter infrastructure is finally re-examined. Section 31 is questioned more openly than ever before. And in some corners of Starfleet, officers are beginning to understand that the future isn't just about hope. It's about earned vigilance. But what questions remain? Will it be enough next time? Because eventually, every pattern becomes a warning. And if the Federation keeps forgetting its scars, someone else will pay the price for its memory. It's easy to focus on the failures, the grand betrayals, the systems that didn't hold. But Starfleet isn't made up of systems. It's made up of people. And sometimes, when policy fails, people step up. They aren't legends. Most won't have ships named after them. But they're why the Federation still exists. Because in the shadow of sabotage, behind the red tape and political compromise, there are officers, doctors, engineers, even junior crew, who choose to do the right thing even when it costs them, well, everything. Take Odo, a literal outsider. As a changeling, suspicion followed him wherever he went, especially once the war with the Dominion began. He wasn't trusted, he wasn't even liked by many in the uniform, but he stayed. He kept doing the work. Not because he had to, but because he believed in what the Federation claimed to be. He enforced the law fairly, even when others saw him as the enemy. He held the line, quietly. Or look at Nog, the first Ferengi in Starfleet. A trailblazer, yes, but he had something more on AR-558. When the glamour of the uniform wore off, and the war turned ugly, Nog stood his ground. He fought. He lost his leg. And when he returned, he wasn't the same. Ultimately, I would argue, he was better. He was brave. He was grounded. He was the kind of officer Starfleet needed. Not because of his species, not because of his rank, but because ultimately, he chose to come back and not to let it define him. Dr. Julian Bashir, genetically enhanced, once almost recruited by Section 31, could have disappeared into the Shadow War. Section 31 spoke to his need to want to be a secret agent. Instead, he used that knowledge to fight Section 31, risked his career to expose them. Because his oath mattered, more than power, more than mystique. These are the stories that don't make headlines, that aren't etched into the monument walls. But they're the soul of the Federation. Even Ensign Sito Jaxa, a disgraced cadet given a second chance, accepted a classified mission along the Cardassian border. She didn't make it back. But she died proving that redemption isn't just something Starfleet talks about. It's something its officers live. And that's the thing no one talks about in all these critiques, in all these think pieces about Starfleet hubris or Federation arrogance. Sometimes it works. Not because the system is perfect, but because someone inside it refuses to let it fail.
They don't wear Black Ops uniforms. They don't sit in war rooms. They help a colleague. They follow a code. They say no when it's easier to say nothing. You want to understand why the Federation survives? It's not because it's the strongest. It's because even when the dream fractures, someone out there keeps choosing to believe in it. Not in theory, not in propaganda, but in the quiet, everyday moments when no one is watching. For all its pride, the Federation can learn. Not quickly, not cleanly, and rarely without cost. But it learns. When the Mars synth attack shattered public trust, Starfleet didn't just retreat. It shut down all synthetic research. It was fear-driven, yes, and not without prejudice, but it was a response. The price was too high to ignore. And years later, long after the damage, reform began. Starfleet re-engaged with synthetic life. Slowly, cautiously, but this time with better oversight. The next generation of AI, like those seen under Soong's guidance, weren't tools. They were people. And this time, that mattered. After the Dominion War, Starfleet's security policies grew up. By Picard Season 3, transport systems were adapted to detect changeling infiltration. It came too late for some, but it came, and that matters, because it showed that Starfleet doesn't just preach learning, it occasionally practices it. That's what makes the Federation unique. Not that it avoids failure, but that it can, eventually, admit it. We see it in the cultural shift after Wolf 359, where tactical doctrines changed. New ships like the Defiant class were developed, and Starfleet finally accepted that diplomacy doesn't always come first. We see it when Captain Shaw, a man traumatized by Starfleet's failures, still chooses to protect the very ideals he's grown cynical about. We even see it in Admiral Janeway, once the most hardened, pragmatic survivor of Voyager's journey, who now works to defend the next generation with more transparency and restraint than ever before. These aren't perfect solutions, but they're something more important. They're movement. And that's what makes the dream believable. Not utopia, not perfection, but growth. Real, uncomfortable, human growth. Doesn't erase what went wrong, but it does suggest that the next time, Starfleet might get it right just a little bit sooner. The Federation doesn't survive because it's perfect. It survives because enough people still believe in what it could be. That belief is fragile. Every war, every betrayal, every compromise chips away at it. And yet, it endures. In a universe where every other empire becomes more ruthless to survive, the Federation's refusal to harden completely isn't naivete. It's resistance. It takes strength to believe in peace, to trust when it's easier to fear, to defend the rights of others when you're under attack, to offer mercy when vengeance would be justified. That's not weakness. That's willpower. Because idealism isn't the absence of threat. It's a conscious choice to stand for something better in spite of the threat. And when the Federation fails, when its security lapses, when its policies fall short, when its people betray its ideals, the solution isn't to abandon the dream. It's to remember why it mattered in the first place. You don't strengthen Starfleet by discarding its values. You strengthen it by defending them better. You tighten protocols. You learn from mistakes. You screen for threats without becoming one. You empower your officers to act ethically and intelligently. Because if you abandon the Federation's ideals to protect the Federation, you're not protecting it at all. You're just preserving the name. Security will always be a weakness in an idealistic society. But maybe that's the point. The Federation isn't safe because it's paranoid. It's safe because it dares to be hopeful. And hope, in this universe, is the most dangerous and powerful weapon of all.